All right, welcome, everybody. Now, excuse us here. Yeah, Ben?
Glad to see Davis move on.
Yes,
About Baycott or something.
Welcome, everybody. We are officially online, and there are some people rejoicing about Duke's victory, but we are particularly happy at this point in time on Daylight Savings Day to welcome Denise Dombkowski Hopkins once again. For those of you who couldn't join us last week, just a reminder that Denise, professor of Hebrew Bible Emerita at Wesley Theological Seminary, also has a vast experience, as we'll find out as we pepper ourselves through this discussion. She studied twice at the Ecumenical Institute for Theological Studies on the West Bank, particularly as you will hear some comments about that too. She's received awards and grants, Yale Center for Faith and Culture. She received the Exemplary Teaching Award at Wesley. She's published widely. She's written about Lamentations. But she really is very focused and devoted on bringing the scripture alive to the pastoral studies. And just recently published a book, Biblical and Pastoral Bridge Work, the interdisciplinary conversations. Always provocative and sure to get us involved. We really do welcome you, Denise, as we look at this very difficult time period that we're living through, and remind ourselves that history maybe not exactly repeating itself, but it does speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. It's always a pleasure to be at Bradley Hills because you are a very intelligent group who ask very good questions. And I want to acknowledge Jean Dudek, who is here today, who was my teaching assistant at Wesley for many, many, many years in Intro to Hebrew Bible and a published author herself. And I am going to do a quick recap of what we covered last week for those of you who weren't here. But before that, there was a question about what is the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. And that is something I tackle in my very first class in Intro to Hebrew Bible at Wesley. And to say the word Old Testament, one has to stop and think about what you mean by old. And so I put my class through an exercise asking them for synonyms for old. And what crops up are things like surpassed, worn out, superseded. Some people say traditional, to be honored as source. So it really depends on when you use the term Old Testament, what you mean by old. Now, the problem with Old Testament is that Jews don't have a New Testament. Jews have what they call Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, which is the first 5 books, Nebi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings, the 3 major sections of Hebrew Bible. If they have the New Testament, it really is their Talmud. The Talmud is a rabbinical interpretation of Hebrew Bible. So I insist on the term Hebrew Bible instead of Old Testament as a way to remind Christians that they're not the only ones who lay hands on the first part of our canon. For Jews, what Christians call the Old Testament is their Bible. So Hebrew Bible simply says it is a collection of traditions written primarily in the Hebrew language, and it's claimed not only by Christians, but by Jews and also Muslims who call Christians and Jews people of the book. So if you go to the Quran in Islamic tradition, you will see variations, for instance, on the story of Abraham and Isaac. There are some collections in the Quran that parallel what we have in Hebrew Bible. So I am always using the term Hebrew Bible because I don't want Christians to think that somehow the Old Testament is something we can throw away. And as I remind my students, Jesus was a Jew. And guess what his Bible was? It was Hebrew Bible. There was no New Testament when Jesus was alive. So does that answer your question, Carol?
Yes, thank you. Wow,
Okay.
sort of. And I need to learn a lot more, but go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, everyone can always audit any class in Wesley Theological Seminary for a modest fee. And I've had auditors in my class from Congress, from the federal government in various capacities. You'd be very welcome. Okay,
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
all right.
even better.
All right, so I am going to reprise very briefly what we did last week for the newcomers. And the topic of our two sessions is this: the Book of Lamentations, hope for a fragmented people then and now. Notice the question mark, because I'm still struggling with the answer to that question. We talked about Pablo Picasso's Weeping Woman as a symbol of suffering during the Spanish-American War. It was his response to the bombing of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. And I use that portrait because the Book of Lamentations begins with one of, well, actually two of the voices. There are varied voices in the Book of Lamentation representing different angles of vision on what has happened to the people. And the Book of Lamentations begins with this verse: "How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become." So here, Jerusalem, sometimes referred to as daughter Zion. Zion is one of the hills in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is personified as a woman, and she is now experiencing loneliness, isolation, all of the effects of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 587. I'm going to skip over this. Here we see a portrait or a picture, a painting by James Tissot, the late 19th century, The Flight of the
Denise?
Prisoners, his view of what it was like when Jerusalem was destroyed. The Babylonians are the largest empire in the ancient Near East at this time. They march into Jerusalem, put it under siege for 2 years, and carry out 3 deportations, one in 597, one in 587, one in 582. And here you see a stream of refugees flowing out of Jerusalem.
Can you hear me? I hate to interrupt. We can't see your slides.
Oh, dear Lord. Oh, dear. That's because I did not share screen. Oh, my goodness. I was just chomping at the bit to get ready. You know what? I can't share. Okay, let's see.
I think you have to get in.
Can you see this?
It's coming, not yet. It'll be there.
It says that it's coming. There you go.
Yes.
You can see it?
Yes.
So sorry. Okay, so this is my question. Here is the Picasso painting of the Weeping Woman that I set alongside of Weeping Daughter Zion, or personified Jerusalem. Here is James Tissot's painting of the forced migrations. Scholars used to talk about Babylonian exile, but exile is such an abstract word. Forced migrations, these people had no choice. They had to be relocated. And they were taken to Babylon and thrown into a different culture separated from their traditions, their capital city, everything that had been familiar. And one of the questions I asked last week that we should still be contemplating is what forced migrations do we remember in our own United States history, and what forced migrations are taking place in the world today? We talked about the Cherokee Trail of Tears in the United States. I talked particularly about Trump's idea of removing 2.2 million Palestinians from Gaza and forcing them to Egypt, to Jordan and wherever, when those economies are on the brink as it is, and they've already, particularly Jordan, absorbed so many Palestinian refugees. I guess in order to make a Riviera on the Mediterranean in the Middle East. So we should think of this not in terms of exile, but in terms of forced migration. We talked about one of the main points of these two sessions is that Lamentations is trying to bring together in its response to these forced migrations and the destruction of Jerusalem. And remember, the temple was destroyed, the walls were torn down, the city was set on fire. There was not much left. One of the things the Book of Lamentations does is bring together the collective voices of the community and individual voices. And I want us again to see this quote from Kai Erikson about the difference between individual and collective trauma, because it's going to come into play when we look at Kate Cohen's editorial later on. Kai Erikson says, by collective trauma, I mean a blow to the basic tissues of life, of social life, that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. I continue to exist, though damaged. You continue to exist, though distant and hard to relate to. But we no longer exist as a connected pair in a larger communal body. And my argument is that the United States today is no longer a larger communal body. We can call ourselves Americans, but we are split in a very divisive and angry way. And there are a whole lot of I's claiming space and saying, I, it's my way or the highway. And the you, the other, yeah, you're over there, but I'm not really connected to you. Therefore, our communal sense has been eroded. And I'm really fearful that it's going to take a whole long time to get it back. So there are fragmented voices in Lamentations, many shifts of speaker. We already talked about how the so-called narrator, but I really want to talk about the narrator as lamenter. In Hebrew Bible narratives, the narrator usually knows what people are thinking. The narrator's inside their head. The narrator even knows what God is thinking. That's not the person who's speaking about the personified Jerusalem in the Book of Lamentations. This is a person who has his or her own view of what has happened to Jerusalem under the Babylonians. So we begin in verse 1 with that lamenter describing the lonely widow Jerusalem, observing the pain of Jerusalem. And then the personified city herself speaks, and this you can see in at the end of chapter 1 of Lamentations, verse 21. They heard how I was groaning, with no one to comfort me. And that's a refrain in the first two chapters of the Book of Lamentations, spoken by personified Jerusalem. With no one to comfort me. All my enemies heard of my trouble. They are glad that you have done it. And the you is God. It's God. Bring on the day you have announced. And then the personified Jerusalem says, Well, actually, we don't know if it's the personified Jerusalem or the lamenter narrator. In chapter 2, verse 20, look, O Lord, and consider, to whom have you done this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have born? And several times in the book of Lamentations, we have a testimony that starvation is so rampant. Because remember, the Babylonians have laid siege to Jerusalem and no food can come in and they've exhausted their stores. So women are actually boiling and eating their children. And this is what happens in wartime. In the Sudan, where starvation is rampant and no one thinks about it because it's in Africa. Should women eat their offspring, the children they have born? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? The young and the old are lying on the ground in the streets. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. In the day of your anger, you have killed them, slaughtering without mercy. And that verse is one of the reasons why I do not think Jeremiah authored the book of Lamentations. Even though traditionally he's been seen as the author, he wanted people to accept responsibility for their situation. He said, you violated covenant, therefore this is your punishment. This is not confessing any sin. This is saying, God, you did this. Why did you do this? And that is totally opposed to Jeremiah's message. So I don't think Jeremiah authored Lamentations. And again, we see there's no monolithic response to what has happened, okay? There's also speeches of some man in chapter 3 who talks about the suffering that people have undergone in terms of war imagery, weapons, and dying. Notice that Lady personified Jerusalem, daughter Zion, talks about women and children and starvation, but the man in chapter 3 talks about really weapons of war. So if you look at chapter 3, verse 4, he, meaning God, has made my flesh and my skin waste away and broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has made me sit in darkness like the dead of long ago. And then look at verse 10. God is compared to, this is chapter 3, he is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He led me off my way and tore me to pieces. Look at the violent imagery that's used for God. This is how the people feel. And it is, it's a searing indictment of God. Finally, we get the speech of the community in Lament in chapter 5, which we'll look at in a minute. But look at all these different voices giving different angles of vision on the suffering in under the Babylonians. As I said before, when you talk about the man in chapter 3, there's a shift from the domestic realm to the public realm, from citizens to the military, from female to male. Now, let's go to chapter 3, because I would bet that the only part of Lamentations that most Christians know occurs in chapter 3 in, I'm ahead of myself. I will come back to that. There's another complaint from the community this time about God's absence. That's very much like Daughter Zion's speech in chapter 1. So if you look at chapter 3, verses 42 following, we have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgotten. So look at the we there, we. Now my question is, can we use a we in America today? We have transgressed? Do you think that people in blue states and people in red states could talk about we in terms of confessing what they did wrong together? I'm asking the question because I really want to know. Anybody?
No.
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 It seems a difficult task, doesn't it? And we'll talk more about why in a minute, okay? So the whole point that particularly Elizabeth Boas in a book called Bible Through the Lens of Trauma wants to make is that only by hearing individual voices can we come together in a we. And I remember when I first read the article, I had question marks in all of the margins because it's very difficult to hear these different voices and then bring them together in a we, because it's predicated upon really hearing what the other side says. And I'm not sure we're good at that. Okay, chapter 4, there's another communal response, and it's graphic descriptions of suffering after the war. So let's turn to chapter 4. Look at verse 4. The tongue of the infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives them anything. When you look at this picture, what comes to mind? Whose children are starving?
Palestinians.
Palestinians, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where Israel for a time has now blocked off any humanitarian aid. It's another path to genocide. In the Sudan, rebels are blocking humanitarian aid in Sudan. And in Washington, D.C., there are children who go to bed hungry every single night. We don't have to go out of this country to see that. Now, if Medicaid is cut and disabled and elderly and children are affected by that, we have another graphic description of suffering, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, we do.
Chapter 5, the community's voice in lament. And what's striking about 5 is the pervasive use of we, our, and us. And Elizabeth Boas, the woman I quoted before, says that this is an example of a reformed community. Reformed, meaning they have come together now in a new way. The problem is, who's not left to join that we? Who got forced marched to Babylon? Which portion of the community? I left that out when I talked about it because I wanted to see if you remembered.
You said the elite.
Yes, thank you, Carol. The elite. The elites are the only people who can live inside the city walls, okay? Peasants always live outside the city walls. What percentage of ancient Israel's population could we deem the elites? That would be officers in the military, it would be the royal court, the king, and those craftspeople who served the elite in the city. What percentage of the population? Remember?
Well, remember?
Between 5 and 10.
Yeah, it was like.
5 and 10?
5%. Yes, 5%. 95% of the population is illiterate peasantry. They're outside the walls, and you better believe that when the Babylonians came, that the elite in the city did not open the gates and say, "Come on in, peasants." They kept them outside to take whatever the Babylonians were going to dish out, because they, inside the city, only had a limited store of food, and they weren't going to share it with the peasants. So this we speaking, as Elizabeth argues, does not include the elites. It includes the poor. So my argument is we still have a division. And it's a fascinating history when the Persians finally knock off the Babylonians in 539 with Cyrus the Great, and they allow and bankroll the return of the elites to Judah. But boy, those elites want to call the shots again, even though for 2 generations, the poor who were left in the land were doing just fine without them, thank you very much. And so we get an inner conflict in the Jewish community, again, between the elites and the peasantry. That whole history is fascinating. And if you love Ezra and Nehemiah, I'm going to knock them off the pedestal for you if we ever do that at Bradley. So
Okay.
the voices of collective identity are voices of a traumatized group united in suffering. It's a unity not seen very much outside of chapter 5. And Boas argues that this shows the trauma process enacted by the poetry moves from fragmented voices to naming suffering together. So let's look at how they name it. Look at chapter 5. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to aliens. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. And then there's this communal confession in 7. Our ancestors sinned, they are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Okay, look at all that communal language. All right. So then we get into the question in the United States, when we say we have suffered, doesn't suffering look different oftentimes to a red state person and a blue state person?
Oh, gosh, yes.
Mhm.
Now, yeah, granted, there are some things that we can all agree on. Inflation is not something that we want. I think we're all together in that, yes? Inflation is not something we want. But beyond some very kind of evident shared concerns, we have a whole lot of different concerns, right? And again, does it break down? How does it break down? Well, demographic analyses are changing. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's look at how chapter 5 ends. Could someone read verses 19 through 22? 19 through 22 of chapter 5.
Jean Dudek, are you there?
I'll do it.
Yay, Jean's coming to the rescue with her trusty Bible.
Okay, I'm here. I'm opening my new NRSV updated edition. And I'm going to see, aha, they did not put Lamentations. Ah, there is Lamentations. And we want chapter 5 verses, what again?
19 through 22.
But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure.
Thank you, Jean. Jean is a biblical storyteller, and she's done several, I know she's done some things for you, but she's done several videos in my classes because you cannot read the Bible like a phone book. It's a story. You have to tell it. You have to nuance it. What do you all think of that ending to the Book of Lamentations? What strikes you emotionally about it? Anybody?
Questioning.
They're still
God.
questioning. We're not so
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
cliffhanger, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's a cliffhanger. And notice what Jean did in the very last verse. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. In other words, is the covenant going to be restored? Are we going to be in relationship with you? We're not so sure.
Mhm.
We're not
Right.
so sure. How does that make you feel?
They're
'Cause
very huge.
aren't preachers told you're supposed to give them something hopeful? That you're supposed to leave the church with some hope? Lamentations? Yeah. Lamentations is not going to shovel up any platitudes and easy sayings for you, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're questioning their faith.
They
Yes,
are.
they are.
Faith,
Yep.
yeah.
They're questioning their faith, and I can understand that politically. Yes, I can understand that.
And also going on in our country, the number of young people that are none.
Oh,
Yes.
Incredible.
And
Yes.
my question, Denise, is if this was written, it must have been written by, somebody who's literate. So do you think the writers can speak for the illiterate to join the men?
Oh, that is a good question, Carol. You're absolutely right. This whole depositive Hebrew Bible was told orally and then written down. But one thing I can say, remember we talked last week about how there may have been some public fasting and mourning on the site of the destroyed temple. And that was the seedbed for the Book of Lamentations, and also for that ritual Tish B'Av that we talked about, that Jews still today observe mostly in the month of August, to remember tragedies like the destruction of the first and second temples, the Holocaust, etc., the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, all of those things, right? So I would say there's kind of a partnership here. And there is also a respect for oral tradition. In other words, these mourning rituals and this language, there's no one to comfort me, was spoken orally for a couple of generations and then maybe written down later, because the elites themselves could not ignore that oral tradition that swelled up from the peasantry. And that's hard for us to grasp because we're not really an oral culture anymore. We're not even a literate culture anymore. We do bastardizations of words in texting, like LOL and gosh, I'm not even up on all of them, right? So does that answer your question, Carol?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a
guess.
good question, and I wish we could trace the whole process of how that got written down.
Because of the oral presentation, then maybe, yes, the voices of those who felt unheard are, represented. I don't know. Yeah, but
Yep.
still uncertain. Yeah.
Yep. Again, I wish I were a fly on the wall. So part of the response to trauma in the trauma narrative process is naming who is responsible. And there was a question raised at the beginning of class about they seem to be blaming God. Yes, they do seem to, but we also saw some confession in which they're blaming themselves. But the naming is a key part of the trauma response because it's a way to regain control of the chaos and the loss of meaning. Because remember last week I talked about how trauma shatters what we thought we knew about the world. It shatters our relationships with one another, with God, even our notion of who we are, okay? And if we say that we sinned, as they do in chapter 5, we believe that we can do better next time and avoid punishment. So there's a seed of hope in that confession that says, okay, we get it, we won't do it again, and therefore our relationship will be good again. Y'all understand that? So in that sense, this communal confession in chapter 5 means that lament is survival literature, okay? Now, who else is responsible? The Babylonians. But again, they're agents of God. All of this raises the question of theodicy. Someone please define for me theodicy. Anybody know?
The role, existence of God? I don't know. You mean, yeah.
Anybody want to add to that? Theodicy comes from two Greek words, theos, God, dike, justice. Theodicy is a question about God's justice. How can God be good and powerful and caring if people suffer like this? if there is evil in the world. There is a tension that theodicy raises between human and divine responsibility. Is it all our fault? Is it all God's fault? Is it both our faults? And any theologian who tells you that they have theodicy figured out is lying to you, okay? There are no fixed theological explanations for this question of God's justice. And the rhetorical function of theodicy is expressed in its dirges, its metaphors, its personifications. We've seen that in the book of Lamentations. God is a bear lying in wait. Jerusalem is personified as a grieving widow. The book of Lamentations itself, most of the chapters are in Hebrew in a dirge form, a funeral lament form. You can't tell from the English, but it's there in the Hebrew. So rhetorically, this book is raising the theodicy question. And also, before I go any further, did we talk last time about core and counter testimony from Walter Brueggemann? I don't think so. No, I can see it on your faces. What? No? Okay, so I think Walter Brueggemann has nailed what that tension is, okay, in theodicy. Brueggemann argues that the Bible is full of core testimony about who God is and what God does. And that testimony is filled with active verbs like God saves. What else could we add to that list? To talk about what we believe is true of God over time. What do you believe about God? God saves. What else does God do?
Judges.
Judges, thank you. Yes. And always we hope they're going to get theirs. We don't need to be judged, right? Okay, what else?
Chooses people.
Chooses.
Thank you. Yes. God chose Israel. God chose Jesus. Okay. What else?
Loves.
Thank you. I was going to say, if I hear God loves one more time without any teeth in it, I'm going to scream. Did you know that the word love in Hebrew, ahav, was used in international treaties throughout the ancient Near East? One nation would love another, and guess what that meant? You had specific obligations to one another. It wasn't a warm, fuzzy, give me a hug and cuddles, which I did all day yesterday with my grandkids. It was so nice. So love has teeth in it, okay? What about God sees everything? What about God is all powerful? God is all knowing. So we have omnipotent, omniscient. How about God is everywhere, omnipresent? Aren't those the foundations of Christian theology?
Yes.
Yeah. Then Brueggemann says the Hebrew Bible is full of counter testimony, which is testimony that grows out of lived experience. Testimony like what we get in the book of Lamentations in chapters 1-4. And those questions challenge all those things we thought we believed about God. So what would be some core testimony? Instead of God being omnipresent everywhere, what does Lamentations say?
Distant.
God is distant or even absent. And let me ask you, does God ever speak in the book of Lamentations?
No.
No. That is about the only book in the entire Hebrew Bible where God does not say a word. We'll come back to that. Think about that. Okay, if God is all powerful, what would counter testimony be?
God's not there.
God doesn't have the power to keep the Babylonians in their place, right? What do we believe? God hears prayer? How many prayers have been offered up in the book of Lamentations? Again and again and again, right? And in fact, the ending prayer ends with a question mark. Are you there? Hello? Unless you're so angry with us, you're never going to be with us again. So counter testimony comes out of lived experience. And I get very tired of sermons that preach nothing but core testimony, and sermons that do not recognize that a whole lot of people are not living or experiencing that core testimony. And it's one thing, it's very easy for us to say, well, hope in God, God always comes through. But how many years do you go on saying that to a starving community, an oppressed community? How long do you expect them to wait? That's why one of the most common words in the laments is why and how long. Yeah.
Yeah.
So too often the church preaches core testimony and excludes counter testimony. And we can't do that. We just can't do that. All right, so very quickly, I don't have my cell phone with me. Somebody give me the time because I want to make sure I'm in bounds. What time is it?
It's not 9:56.
Thank you. Okay, so let's come at the Book of Lamentations in a different way and talk about themes, thematic responses to the destruction of Jerusalem. We talked about different voices. If these are eyewitness reactions to exile, which could include some exilic voices, to go back to Carol, but I think primarily this really is the peasants coming together. There is grief, which we've already seen in the verses we've read. Mothers boiling their children, the lonely Jerusalem sitting like a widow. There's doubt. We saw the ending of chapter 5. Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, we're toast. There are accusations of God, who is the bear lying in wait, the perverse shepherd. What does the New Testament say about God and Jesus? They're the good shepherd, right? Jesus is the good shepherd, right? Well, in Lamentations, God is a perverse shepherd. The Lord has become like an enemy, says chapter 3, verse 5. Or, yeah. Then we saw confession in chapter 5, and maybe some hope interspersed. And we're going to look at the hope piece in a minute. I'm going to go again very quickly through this because we've seen it. Chapters 1, 2, and 4 are in the form of funeral dirges or laments over the dead city who's personified as a woman. The festivals go unobserved. The enemy, this is like rubbing salt in the wound. They are repeatedly laughing and taunting those who are looking at the ruins of the temple. Hunger and starvation are common. Widows and children forage for food, even eat their children. The language is just dire. The language of destruction, collapse of the ritual world, physical suffering, emotional anguish, the whole gamut of grief. And again, this is a Palestinian picture of people lining up with what pots they could salvage for food. What's happening in Gaza is an outrage, in case you haven't guessed my view. Doubt is another major theme, common questions about the exile surface and what's implicit in these questions. And here we get into this notion of theodicy and core and counter testimony. God is unwilling or unable to save them. And what does core testimony say about God? God saves. God has the power to save. God wants to save us, right? And while they're scrounging for food, smelling the smoke of a burnt Jerusalem, tending to wounds from war, they're thinking, where is God? God, don't you want to save us? Are you not powerful enough to save us? That's a repeated question in the exile. And maybe, just maybe, the theological challenges are worse than any physical, social, or economic problems that they're facing. And if you want to know why maybe young people are not flocking to church anymore, it's because the church is not adequately answering the counter testimony questions that people are raising now. I mean, think about, I'm a boomer, okay? I'm the boomer generation. My children are millennials. Will they be better off than I am? That's questionable, especially since my daughter got a pink slip from the Department of Education, which is shattering. Where do young people fit in a culture changing so very rapidly? Is college worth it anymore? Look at what's happening to students with loans. The government has even taken away links to, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, because I just got a flash that says my internet's unstable. The government has taken away links to agencies that tie repayment of loans to your income and your family situation. Those links are no longer available. I don't know if you knew that. So, aside from the question of forgiving loans, students with heavy loans do not have access to pay linked to what you're earning. And if you weren't earning minimum wage, you now have to go to agencies that are charging more than you can pay per month. What's going to happen to those young people? I don't know. I don't know. So it's appropriate that the book ends with doubt. And yes, one of the themes is accusation of God, who is the merciless enemy in chapter 2, verse 5. In 3:1 and 18, God is the perverse shepherd, and a bear lying in wait, a warrior who has forced them into cannibalism. Oh, and you know this picture of a shepherd? That's a young boy. Do you know that in ancient Israel, children as young as 6 and 7 would take the sheep out to grazing lands that were not contiguous to the family plot, and they would meet with other young children who were shepherding the flocks and build a fence of stones around the flocks at night, and they would all lay down in the entrance to prevent beasts of prey from decimating the flocks. Oh, there's the core encounter testimony. And that states what I just discussed. Confession is another theme. Complaint and doubt can lead to self-examination. Judah realizes its suffering is the direct result of its sin, and God's judgment is accepted by daughter Zion, or the personified Jerusalem. It's accepted by the man in chapter 3. It's accepted by the community in chapter 5. So notice all these conflicting themes and conflicting emotions. There's not one monolithic response to this kind of suffering. And then hope. And I want us to turn to 3:21 through 24. And this is the text that I think most Christians know from Lamentations. And if they don't know it's from Lamentations, they know it from a hymn. Could someone read chapter 3, verses 21 through 24?
Okay,
Ben, are you?
I've got that.
No, Ben has it. He was first.
But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him.
Thank you. Well read. Thank you. Has anybody heard, great is thy faithfulness? Great is thy faithfulness. Yes? You sing that hymn, don't you?
Yes, we do.
It comes from the book of Lamentations. And I can't tell you, and Jean can attest to this, how many students think that's the whole of the book of Lamentations? Yeah. You know, and I love that hymn. It's a wonderful hymn, right? It's core testimony. In its bones, that hymn is all about core testimony. But the book does not sustain that hope. It cannot sustain that hope. Where do you find that little gem of hope in terms of the structure of the book?
The middle.
Yes,
Right.
the middle. And
Yeah,
what's it sandwiched by?
a lot of despair.
Yeah, grief and despair, and then questioning at the end. Those are the bookends of this hope, right? And what do we want to do as Christians? We want to jump right to the middle and kind of bracket out, put on the back burner those really hard questions and all that grief, right? Little grief is okay, but please, as people told my mother when she was leaning over my brother's casket, he's dead at 23 from drowning. And I remember one person coming through and saying, can't you give your mother a Valium to stop her from crying?
Oh my goodness.
And I said, if you can't be with her in her grief, you can leave. And I'm grieving myself, right? People are uncomfortable with questions. People are uncomfortable with expressions of pain and suffering. So what do they go to? They go to this hope. So I want to know, how do we as a community sustain that hope? That's the key question, right? And that's something I think Susan Andrews may have addressed in her sermon a couple of weeks ago, right? But
And her
there's,
talk.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
another angle to this. If you're questioning God and you're in the midst of all this pain and suffering, when you blurt out these words, the steadfast love, really the best translation of that word chesed is the covenant loyalty of God never ceases. What are you doing in terms of, what is God thinking when God hears that?
Maybe you're denying their suffering. I don't know.
Oh, okay. I think you got it, Carol. I think this community is reminding God about how God is supposed to be. How about that? That happens in the laments in the book of Psalms all the time. In the middle of an angry lament that's talking about God's absence, right? All of a sudden you get this little burst of a hymn praising God. It's, hey, God, remember how you're supposed to be? Right? That's another way in which this particular passage could function. Now, here's an interesting thing. The only part of Lamentations that makes it into the Revised Common Lectionary, which a lot of pastors use for their preaching, right? You go to the lectionary, what are we preaching on this week? The only text that makes it into the lectionary is what we just read in chapter 3, the text on hope.
Oh my, this is a whole.
Interesting.
And I tear my hair out. I want the Revised Common Lectionary redone. That is not an accurate reflection of the book of Lamentations. So does this give some credence to my complaint that we don't like to question or grapple with the tough questions? We want to sing hymns like Great is Thy Faithfulness. And my argument is this passage is not characteristic of the book as a whole. It's one of many voices. And this portrait is The Weeping Woman by Helen Zug-Hayeb. She is Palestinian. And it's very near and dear to my heart. Now, Kathleen O'Connor wrote a book called Lamentations and the Tears of the World, and she calls Lamentations a safe place for tears that mirrors back the pain that we want to deny. And I think that's an accurate description. And I want to know why we don't have more places in our Sunday liturgies that create places that are safe space for tears? I want to know why every Sunday has to be so upbeat, even in the season of Lent. And when I've been asked to preach during Lent, I always insist that I will preach from an angry lament. Because if we really want to follow Jesus to Golgotha and his final lament from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then we better get used to, comfortable with the language of lament and its questions. So O'Connor argues that the people are allowed to react to the collapse of their physical, emotional, and spiritual universe. And Boas, in her book, The Bible Through the Lens of Trauma, said, takes this angle. The book allows communal experience to reform. It does more than simply witness to suffering. I don't think O'Connor goes that far. I don't think she talks about a reformation of community. I think she says, this is too raw right now. We're not even ready for that. And as I said before, God never responds. O'Connor argues that God doesn't respond because what can be said to that depth of pain? In that sense, she says, the silence reverences the people's pain, and God's silence is necessary for survival. But look at the bottom. Here is a protest sign. Silence is compliance. So I'm asking you all, if God were to speak in the book of Lamentations, what would God say? What would a chapter 6 look like? Because right now, this book makes no attempt to resolve the tension, which is directly opposed to Elizabeth Boas's argument. Anybody have any ideas about what a chapter 6 might look like, or what God might say? Anybody?
Anybody, if you're remote, you're welcome to unmute.
Let me see, there's one thing in the chat. What does it say? Oh, would you share your screen? That's from before. Okay. All right. You're all hard pressed to come up with something, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
What can you say?
We all want to have a happy ending somewhere. I mean, that's, I think that our society tries to make it, it's not okay.
But it's not only our society, it's our Christian theology.
Well,
What
even
cross
more
do you
so.
have in your sanctuary? Do you have Jesus on the cross in your sanctuary?
No.
That is Catholic.
Your cross represents the resurrection, doesn't it?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a frame already for what goes on in that sanctuary in there. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
that's a difference between Catholics and Protestants, because the Catholics have Jesus on the cross, and Lent is a much more solemn time in the Catholic tradition. And
That's a very good point. The
It's
crucifix is
rosary
very clearly
on-
present.
they have the rosary, you have
Mhm.
the birth rosaries, then you have the suffering rosaries, and then you have the glorious mysteries, as they call them.
Well,
So
and yeah, and
Yeah.
rosaries normally have a crucifix attached to the end.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yep. So where's the balance? We've got a crucifix on one hand, resurrection cross on the other,
Up there.
and you really can't have one without the other, right? Yeah. So what happens in Lent? How many people show up
Actually it is, because the other
for
one
Holy
died.
Thursday and Good Friday, as opposed to who shows up on Easter? Is there a big difference?
Yes.
Everybody turns out for Easter, right? They want the
Yes.
trumpets and the lilies and the hymns, but Good Friday, at least in my United Church of Christ church, it's a small group that show up for Good Friday.
As it is for Ash Wednesday.
Yes,
Rich.
thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shower and run here.
excuse us, unless you have something to say, mute yourself. I'm going to be muting people because of the background noise. Okay, thanks. If you have something to say, let us know, but unmute yourself. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
So Carol, did you have a chance to share the editorial by Kate Cohen with everyone?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so,
But not.
I think,
yeah, no,
everything.
that's fine. I was struck when I was preparing this presentation on the Book of Lamentations by an editorial in the Washington Post on Monday, February 24th, on page A15. It's by Kate Cohen, and her title is up at the top of this slide. Can we see eye to eye without a shared reality? So I read that and I said, whoa, Elizabeth Boas is arguing that chapter 5 reforms a community, takes these fragmented voices of the personified Jerusalem, the narrator slash lamenter, the man in chapter 3, and melds them together into a we who have a shared suffering and can speak with one voice. And then I read this headline, can we see eye to eye without a shared reality? And I said, let's put that editorial side by side with the Book of Lamentations. And so I will share whoops.
Yeah,
I will
if
share
anyone
snippets.
wants, I could give it to him, but go
Yeah.
ahead. Better to do it this way.
I will share snippets from Cohen's editorial, and I really want your reactions. Kate, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she discusses a new book by Kurt Gray called Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground. That's exactly what Elizabeth Boas is looking for in the Book of Lamentations, common ground, a shared suffering. So Kurt Gray's book is the dialogue partner for Kate Cohen in her discussion. Why we fight about morality and politics and how to find common ground. Gray, the author she's discussing, is a professor of moral psychology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Sorry, you Duke fans. And Gray argues that most Americans belong to what he calls an exhausted majority. That's me. That's me. That's my son. That's my daughter. It's my son-in-law. An exhausted majority that, quote, just wants its government to get things done and the economy to help people flourish, unquote. This claim appears, says Cohen, to contradict the assertion that we seem constantly angry. That's an interesting juxtaposition there. Anger versus exhaustion. What do you see most in the Book of Lamentations, anger or exhaustion?
exhaustion.
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion, I think so too. Yeah, I think they don't even have enough energy to be really angry.
I failed to recognize a comment in the chat, thinking that perhaps a chapter 6, Gloria had said.
Oh, yes.
Might be a cry for restoration. I don't know, but go ahead with.
Okay, we'll come back to
right
that.
now.
We'll come back to that. And so Gray goes on to argue that all humans make moral judgments by weighing harm. This is an interesting idea. Because our prehistoric ancestors were vulnerable to predators, we constantly scan even our safe environments for signs of threat to ward off danger, right? It's built into us as human beings. Then Gray goes on to say liberals and conservatives, whatever those titles mean, arrive at different moral conclusions because we weigh harms differently based on whom we believe to be vulnerable. Think about that. We weigh harms differently based upon whom we believe to be vulnerable. Take the issue of abortion. Let's just jump right into it. I, says Kate Cohen, am more concerned for the pregnant person. A pro-lifer is more concerned for the fetus, but we both want to prevent harm. Gray calls harm the master key of morality. Okay, so what's the problem? If we both, on both sides of the abortion issue, want to prevent harm, what are we left with? If one group is more concerned perhaps for the harm for the pregnant woman, and another group is more concerned for harm to the fetus, what are we left to do with that? Aren't we left to say, well, which harm is greater?
Yeah,
Pretty
Right?
much.
pretty much, yeah.
Who is vulnerable to the greatest harm?
And that's the big,
And that's
What-
the big argument, yeah.
Yeah, and who's to decide that, right? Who's to decide that? So that's just kind of kicking the can down the road in my view. But what if the harm that a person sees isn't real? And this is what I really want to get at, because we live now in an age of disinformation. We saw it in spades in the presidential inaugural address. If we fact checked it, and you know what, we could fact check every presidential address and find that that the statistics were wrong. It's an equal opportunity kind of unreality. Okay. Okay, so in the immigrant issue, for instance, in the whole
And Denise, we're really running out of time, so.
okay, all right. Thank you. Okay. In terms of immigrants, what if someone believes that undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crime than citizens are? Okay, that's a belief. There are statistics to show that is not true. Okay, that person does not accept those statistics. What happens to this notion of harm then? Okay.
Well, yeah.
So we're in this mess, says Cohen, because one side's perception of harm is increasingly disconnected from reality. So if you're going to make moral judgments about anything on the basis of harm, and the harm you evaluate is not based on truth, where does that leave us? How do we talk to each other? Okay, so
Yes.
here we have the book of Lamentations that is bringing these diverse voices together, and together they end with a question, which for me kind of obliterates Elizabeth Boas's argument. The question says, we really can't decide any of this. We're in a mess,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. And I do think we're going to have to thank you for leaving us this way.
Yes, and leaving you in all kinds of questions and
Yeah.
a low point. But you know what? I cannot make this scripture say what it doesn't say.
No, and we have a session next week that attempts to address where our congregation and different folks in our congregation are by opening up discussion. Where we're having a facilitated open forum discussion to process the uncertainty of our times. And we're going to be looking at how do we process the last 90 days? Where are we in our community so that people can share what they're experiencing and what questions they have with each other? How can we as a church provide safety, support, and care to vulnerable members of our community, especially immigrants and LGBTQ? But I think folks are facing job loss. They're dealing with each other who are facing job loss, incredibly difficult questions, not unlike some of the despair that we've heard in Lamentations. David will kick off the session, but it will be facilitated. We will not be recording the session so that people can feel safe and secure in helping each other and coming together. And we really do, though, appreciate your coming together with us at this difficult time, Denise. I think you've laid it out that this is something we need to be facing, and finding as best we can the truth, but not to be embarrassed about lamenting the situation. So thank you so much again, and hope we can continue to have you as part of our congregation in many ways as we seek to learn
I
more.
hope so too. This is a wonderful group.
Really.
And you can make a difference. You can make a difference.
Thank you, and you too, as well as you lead us in study. Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.